On a frigid winter morning, Raphael Delian found himself standing in the quiet solitude of his sprawling mansion's kitchen. The air was crisp, each breath he took visible in the cool space. He stared into the half-empty coffee cup before him, the steam rising gently, swirling in the light from the window. There was a serenity to it, an emptiness he had come to crave. The house, as it had been for years, was silent, and he preferred it that way. Silence gave him control. It gave him a sense of stability in a life that had lost its meaning long ago. He could hear the muffled sounds of the world outside, cars in the distance, birds braving the chill. But inside his home, there was only stillness. "Mr. Delian, your car is ready," came the voice of his security guard, breaking the silence. Raphael barely turned his head. He nodded, acknowledging the call, but said nothing in return. He rose from his chair, adjusting his crisp tie as he grabbed his leather briefcase. Another day of meetings awaited, meetings that meant nothing to him anymore. They were just another routine, another round of negotiations, another push toward more wealth that he didn't need. But it was what he had always done, and it kept him moving, kept him from facing the reality that had lingered in the depths of his mind for years now. As he moved through the marble foyer, his footsteps echoed, resounding through the cavernous halls. Mrs. Alvarez, his housekeeper, nodded in greeting as he passed. "Have a good day, sir," she said, her voice soft and respectful. Raphael only offered a slight tilt of his head in return, acknowledging her but not truly seeing her. He never did. It wasn't that he disliked her. He simply preferred not to engage. Emotions, after all, were messy. Connections were painful. His life, since Emma's death, had been carefully constructed around avoiding both. The house, his business, the luxury of isolation, all of it served as a barrier between him and the world he had once known. A world that had been ripped away from him when Emma, his only daughter, had been taken in a terrible accident. The grief, the loss, it was too much to bear. So he avoided it. He buried it beneath layers of work, material success, and endless distractions. Pulling open the heavy front door of the mansion, Raphael stepped out into the bitter cold. The air immediately hit him with a sharp, biting chill, but it was nothing compared to the feeling that gripped him next. There, curled up on the marble steps of his front entrance, was a child. A small girl, no older than 9 or 10, with tangled hair, dirt-streaked cheeks, and a body that looked far too fragile for the bitter cold. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were trying to hold together something she feared might fall apart. Clutched in her hands was an old, worn-out teddy bear, its fur matted and ragged, its one eye missing. But it was not the teddy bear that caused his breath to catch. No, it was the jacket. The jacket she wore was unmistakable. It was pink, the fabric soft but frayed at the edges, and along the hem, tiny embroidered butterflies danced. Raphael's heart stopped. He knew that jacket. He had picked it out himself, 5 years ago, for his daughter Emma. He could see it clearly in his mind. Emma had twirled in the store, laughing, as he had handed it to her, the bright pink fabric shining under the store lights. Emma had loved that jacket. He had bought it for her with the same love and joy that had filled every moment of their time together before she had been taken away from him. But now, here it was, on the back of a homeless child, a girl he had never seen before. Raphael's hand gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white as a strange numbness began to spread through him. The world around him seemed to tilt, the quiet of his mansion suddenly feeling oppressive. The image of the girl, the fragile figure sitting on his doorstep, her eyes wide with fear, her lips trembling in the cold, seemed surreal, as though it couldn't be real. Yet it was. The girl looked up at him, her expression filled with exhaustion, a deep weariness that belied her small frame. She shrank away from him, clutching the teddy bear tighter as though it were the only thing holding her together. Raphael's gaze dropped to the bear in her hands, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. It was his daughter's bear, the same bear that had once belonged to Emma, the one he had placed in her coffin 5 years ago. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion, cracking as he spoke. The girl didn't answer. She just stared at him with those large, dark eyes, as if she didn't know how to explain the weight of the truth. Raphael felt a surge of panic. His mind raced with questions, none of which made sense. How could this be? How could this child have Emma's things? His security guard stepped up behind him. "Should I call the police?" he asked, his voice full of concern, but Raphael didn't hear him. His mind was fixed on the teddy bear, on the jacket, on the girl who didn't speak, who didn't explain. Mrs. Alvarez came hurrying down the steps, her eyes widening when she saw the girl on the steps. "Oh, pobrecita, she's freezing to death," she exclaimed, moving quickly to wrap the child in her arms, trying to offer warmth and comfort. Raphael remained frozen, his eyes still locked on the girl. The bear, the jacket. His heart ached in a way he hadn't felt in years, the numbness inside him cracking open for the first time since Emma's death. "Where is she from?" Raphael whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice trembled. The question seemed so insignificant, so small compared to the turmoil inside him. The girl didn't respond. She simply looked up at him with a look that seemed too wise for her age, too filled with the weight of something he didn't understand. And that was when he saw it, a tiny scribbled word, almost hidden in the corner of her jacket sleeve, a name, barely legible but unmistakable. Mommy. The word struck him like a lightning bolt. His breath caught. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mind was racing, yet the only thing he could hear was that name. The name that had once been his whole world, the name of the woman who had shared his life, and had, too, been taken from him. Mommy. The girl had written it herself, in a corner, almost as if she had wanted to keep it hidden. Raphael felt his knees weaken, his body swaying slightly. It wasn't just that the girl had Emma's bear or her jacket. It was that this little girl knew something about him, something he thought only he had carried with him in the years since his daughter's death. "Mommy." "Isabel," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible, yet it hit Raphael like a blow to the chest. Isabel, his wife, the woman he had loved, the woman who had died with their daughter. But what could this little girl possibly know about Isabel? What did this child, who appeared out of nowhere, know about his deepest heartbreak? The question swirled in his mind, but there was one thing he knew for certain. This was not just a random encounter. This girl, sitting on his doorstep, was a part of something far bigger than he could understand. And as he stood there, still holding the worn teddy bear in his hand, Raphael knew that his life was about to change forever. What started as a moment of pity, a moment of helping a homeless child, was slowly unraveling a truth that he had never expected, a truth that threatened to shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew. The air around Raphael felt thicker now, as though the world had become more tangible, pressing in on him with an urgency he couldn't escape. He was still holding the teddy bear in his hand, the worn, faded fabric of the bear pressing against his palm. He could feel the weight of it, not just physically but emotionally, as if the bear carried with it 1,000 memories that had been locked away, untouched for years. The girl, her head down, was still shivering uncontrollably. Mrs. Alvarez, with her gentle hands, tried her best to comfort her, wrapping her own cardigan tighter around the girl's frail shoulders. Despite the warmth being offered by Mrs. Alvarez, the girl remained distant. Her eyes didn't sparkle like Emma's had, nor did they hold any trace of the joy he remembered in his daughter. Instead, they were dull, empty, almost hollow. Raphael stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The world had shifted beneath his feet in the span of a single moment, and he found himself unable to reconcile the child in front of him with the memories of his own daughter. The girl's presence was like a mirror reflecting his own loss in the most inexplicable way. He had expected, when he'd lost Emma, that the pain would stay with him forever, that it would define every waking moment. What he hadn't expected was the possibility of seeing his past, his lost future, manifested in the eyes of someone he didn't know. Raphael. Mrs. Alvarez's voice broke through his thoughts. She was looking up at him, her face filled with concern. "We can't leave her out here. She's going to freeze to death." The reality of the situation hit him all at once. He was standing in front of a child who needed help, a child whose life had led her to this doorstep in the first place. But still, despite the cold, despite the child's fragile state, Raphael felt a sense of hesitation. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, it was something deeper. This girl, who was wearing Emma's jacket and holding Emma's bear, seemed like an intrusion into his life, into a life he had carefully constructed to shield himself from further pain. He wanted to call someone, call the authorities, take action, but part of him resisted. His mind raced with questions. How could this child have Emma's things? What were the odds? And why was she here, on his doorstep? Was this a cruel joke? A hallucination brought on by his grief? Clara, his assistant, arrived shortly after Mrs. Alvarez, concern painted across her face. She kneeled beside the girl, brushing her fingers against the girl's forehead. "She's burning with fever," Clara murmured, her voice tinged with worry. "We can't leave her like this. She needs immediate help." The words "immediate help" hung in the air, making Raphael feel like a stranger in his own home. He was a man who had built a life of comfort and power, yet in the face of a sick child, he found himself feeling utterly helpless. He didn't know how to respond, how to help, how to open his heart to the possibility that this girl might not just be a stranger, but something else entirely. "Maybe we should call social services," Clara suggested, standing up and brushing the dirt from her knees. "They'll know what to do." Raphael shook his head. "It's after 5. No one will take her in until Monday," he said, his voice hollow. But even as he spoke, he knew that wasn't the real reason for his reluctance. Clara, ever the pragmatist, lowered her voice and spoke with a touch of authority. "One night, Raphael. Just for tonight. We can't leave her out here." Her gaze softened. "It's the right thing to do." He looked at her, then at the small child who was now holding Mrs. Alvarez's hand, the two of them seated on the cold marble steps, the girl's head resting against the housekeeper's shoulder. The child was fragile, her body trembling under the weight of both the cold and the fever. Raphael's thoughts swirled, thoughts of his life, of the empire he had built, of his wife and daughter. He had worked so hard to keep everything in its place, to protect himself from the grief that had once threatened to swallow him whole. But here, standing in front of him, was the stark truth that he couldn't deny. The girl's presence was a reminder of everything he had lost, and perhaps it was a reminder of something more. He didn't know if he could face whatever it was that had brought this child into his life, but he couldn't let her freeze to death on his doorstep either. "All right," he said, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "Bring her inside." Mrs. Alvarez immediately scooped the girl up into her arms, cradling her like a child should have been cradled, safe and warm. Raphael stepped back, his heart thundering in his chest as he watched them move inside. The house that had always been so quiet, so empty, felt even more so now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. For what, Raphael wasn't sure. But there was something here, something undeniable. As they walked into the foyer, Raphael's mind started to piece together fragments of a past he had long since buried. He wasn't sure why this child was wearing Emma's jacket. He wasn't sure why she had Emma's bear. But deep down, he felt a pull, a nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong, something that didn't fit the story he had told himself for years. Clara followed them into the living room, sitting down across from Raphael as Mrs. Alvarez gently laid the girl on the sofa. The child, who had hardly spoken a word since Raphael had first seen her, now clutched the teddy bear tightly in her small hands. Her breathing was labored, shallow from the fever, but her eyes were wide and still alert, darting between the people in the room as if she were trying to understand what was happening. For a moment, there was silence. Raphael stood at the threshold, watching the girl, his mind churning with questions. Why had she come here? Why had fate led her to his doorstep, carrying Emma's belongings? And what did this mean for him? For the life he had built around the pain of losing his daughter? Is she going to be okay? Clara asked softly, looking at Raphael with concern. He didn't know. He didn't have answers for anything. But something told him that the events unfolding before him weren't random. The girl, with her sickly body and haunted eyes, was here for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was about to change everything. As Mrs. Alvarez sat down beside the girl, gently rubbing her back to soothe her, Raphael finally exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of uncertainty. One thing was clear: this night, this chance encounter, was the beginning of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. Something that would force him to confront his own past, his own grief, and perhaps, just perhaps, his own redemption. The warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the bitter cold outside, but Raphael couldn't shake the chill that had settled deep within him. The fire in the hearth crackled, its comforting glow offering no solace to his troubled mind. He watched as Mrs. Alvarez gently settled the girl on the couch, pulling a thick blanket over her frail form. Her eyes, wide and glassy with fever, fluttered closed as if the weight of the world was too much to bear. Clara stood by the window, her arms crossed, her gaze distant as she stared out at the darkness. The soft hum of the house was interrupted only by the occasional cough from the girl, a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the quiet room. Raphael's thoughts swirled like a storm in his head, each one crashing against the other, trying to find a foothold. "Do you think she's going to make it through the night?" Clara asked, her voice breaking the silence like a soft knock at the door of his conscience. Raphael didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the girl, who now clutched the tattered teddy bear, with such intensity that he could almost hear her heart beating in time with it. The worn-out bear, the jacket, the familiar signs of a childhood lost, those were the things that had brought him to this moment. But the girl herself, was something Raphael couldn't quite grasp. She was a puzzle, a riddle that refused to be solved. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice rough. "But she can't stay here. I can't take care of her. I'm not equipped for this." Clara raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp, cutting through the fog of his uncertainty. "Raphael, this isn't about what you're equipped for. This is about doing the right thing. She's a child, a human being. She needs help, and you're the only one who can give it to her right now." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to ignore the responsibility that had just been thrust upon him. Raphael wasn't used to feeling like this, helpless, vulnerable, uncertain. He was a man who had always had control, who had always prided himself on being able to handle any situation. But this was different. He had spent the last 5 years building walls around his heart, trying to keep out the grief, the pain, the memories of Emma. The tragedy that had torn apart his life still haunted him. And yet, here he was, faced with a child who wore the remnants of his lost daughter's world. Was this some cruel twist of fate, a reminder of everything he had lost? Or was there something more, something he wasn't seeing yet? The girl shifted in her sleep, her small body trembling beneath the blanket. Raphael stood up and moved toward her, his steps hesitant, like a man walking toward the edge of a precipice. He didn't know what he was doing, but something pulled him toward her, something he couldn't explain. He sat down beside her, his eyes scanning her delicate features. She was so young, so fragile. Her face, though pale and sickly, held traces of beauty. Her high cheekbones, the way her lips curved slightly in sleep, the faintest hint of innocence that seemed so out of place in the world she had come from. She was a survivor, this child, though Raphael wasn't sure what she had survived or how she had come to be here. At his doorstep, wearing Emma's things, he gently took the teddy bear from her hands, running his fingers over the matted fur. The bear, once bright and full of life, now seemed like a ghost of the past. It reminded him of his own grief, of Emma's absence, of the years he had spent avoiding the truth of her death. He had told himself that moving on was the only way to survive, that he had to bury his pain deep inside in order to keep going. But now, in the presence of this girl, the walls he had so carefully constructed began to crumble, brick by brick. The girl stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, her gaze piercing, like she was seeing through him, beyond him, into some part of his soul that he hadn't shown anyone in years. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Raphael felt a strange pull, an unspoken connection, like she understood him in a way no one else ever had. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. He didn't expect an answer, but something in him hoped she would speak, would tell him why she had come to him, why she had chosen this night, this moment, to cross his path. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the corner of the blanket, pulling it tighter around her shoulders. She shivered once more, but this time, it wasn't from the cold. It was something deeper, something that spoke to a life filled with hardship, loss, and survival. Raphael sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What was he supposed to do with this girl? He couldn't keep her here forever, could he? He wasn't her guardian. He wasn't her father. He wasn't even sure he knew how to care for a child anymore. And yet there was a part of him, a part that he had buried so long ago, that wanted to protect her, to offer her the love and safety that Emma had never received in the end. But could he? Was he capable of caring for this girl without being consumed by the grief of losing Emma all over again? The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Clara, who had been watching him closely, spoke again, her voice quieter now. "You're not alone in this, Raphael. You don't have to do it all by yourself." Her words, simple and direct, carried a truth that Raphael wasn't ready to face. He didn't have to do it all by himself. He could reach out, ask for help, allow himself to be vulnerable. It was a terrifying thought, but in this moment, surrounded by the weight of his own grief and the fragile child lying before him, it felt like the only way forward. As he sat there, watching the girl sleep, he felt a shift inside himself. A slow, tentative crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. Maybe, just maybe, this child, this homeless, sick girl, wasn't a reminder of his pain. Maybe she was a chance for healing, a chance to make a difference in someone else's life, just as he had failed to do for his own daughter. Raphael leaned back in his chair, his mind still reeling, but for the first time in years, he felt something stirring within him that had long since gone cold. Hope. Not for himself, not yet, but maybe for the girl, for the chance to be something he had long forgotten how to be. A protector, a father. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. And in that moment, it was all he could do. The days that followed were a blur of discomfort and unease. Raphael had never been one to welcome disruption. His world, meticulously arranged around work, power, and control, was now shaken by the presence of a small, sickly girl whose name he still didn't know, but whose existence had already changed him in ways he couldn't explain. The first night, Raphael had been unable to sleep. He lay in his large, lonely bed, tossing and turning, his thoughts constantly drifting to the girl. He had gone through the motions, giving her food, making sure she was comfortable, but nothing felt natural. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of Emma, of the life he had lost, of the little girl he had failed to protect. The girl's name, he learned the next morning, was Isabel. She had hardly spoken a word since arriving at his house, but when Mrs. Alvarez had brought her breakfast, Isabel had whispered her name in a voice so faint it was almost imperceptible. Isabel, a name that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of suffering. And yet there was something so fragile about it that Raphael couldn't help but be drawn to her. Despite the barriers between them, those silent walls built by grief, fear, and uncertainty, Raphael found himself wondering more and more about Isabel. Her eyes, so full of pain and resignation, haunted him. She was a mystery, and like any mystery, it gnawed at him, pushing him to seek answers he wasn't sure he was ready to find. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, working through piles of paperwork, he caught sight of the bear again. The one that had been with Isabel, the one that had once belonged to Emma. He hadn't meant to bring it back into his life, but it seemed to have followed him, like a ghost from the past refusing to be laid to rest. The bear sat on his desk, staring back at him with its lone button eye. For a moment, Raphael was paralyzed. The pain, the raw, aching grief, surged forward, flooding his chest. He hadn't been prepared for this. He had thought that moving forward meant leaving the past behind. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing was ever that simple. Clara knocked gently on the door before stepping in. She had been the one to check on Isabel each day, making sure she was fed, that she had medicine for her fever. Raphael had tried to ignore the nagging voice inside him that told him to care more, to get involved. But Clara's presence, her steady hand, had been a lifeline in this unfamiliar chaos. "She's asking for you," Clara said softly, her eyes flicking to the bear on the desk. "Isabel, she wants to talk to you." Raphael nodded, though a knot had formed in his stomach. He had spent days avoiding any real interaction with Isabel, afraid of what it might reveal, afraid of what he might have to face. He wasn't ready for this, for the truth that was beginning to take shape in his mind. But he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He followed Clara to the living room, where Isabel was sitting quietly on the couch. The girl was wrapped in a thick, woolen blanket, her eyes unfocused, but there was something different in the way she looked at him now. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to come to her. "Hi, Isabel," Raphael said softly, crouching down in front of her. His voice felt foreign in his throat, like he was trying to speak a language he had long forgotten. Isabel didn't say anything at first. She simply stared at him, her small fingers clutching the bear in her lap. The silence stretched, and Raphael could feel his anxiety mounting. He didn't know how to break through the walls she had built around herself, or if she even wanted him to. "Isabel," he tried again, his voice cracking slightly. "I want to help you. I know you've been through a lot, but you're safe here. You don't have to be afraid anymore." At those words, something in Isabel shifted. She looked up at him with wide, searching eyes, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was so quiet, so fragile, that Raphael almost didn't catch it. "Mommy," she whispered. "Mommy said I would be safe here." The words hit him like a bolt of lightning. His heart stopped for a moment, and his mind raced to catch up with the enormity of what she had just said. Mommy. Was she referring to her real mother? Or was there something more to this? "Where did you hear that?" Raphael asked, his voice trembling. Isabel didn't answer right away. She simply hugged the teddy bear tighter, as if drawing strength from it. Raphael watched her, his mind spinning. Could this be some sort of coincidence? Could the girl's connection to Emma be a misunderstanding, a random alignment of objects that meant nothing more than just that? But deep down, Raphael knew it wasn't a coincidence. He could feel the pull between their lives, like invisible threads weaving them together in ways that were beyond his comprehension. There was something familiar about Isabel, something about her presence that felt like a reflection of the past, of a life he had tried so desperately to forget. "Isabel," Raphael began again, his voice quieter this time, almost reverent. "Do you remember your mommy?" The girl nodded slowly, her eyes still distant. "She said you would help me," she repeated, her words like a mantra, as if she were reassuring herself that she was in the right place. Raphael sat back on his heels, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Was it possible that this little girl, this stranger, could somehow be connected to his daughter, to Emma? Could she be a part of the past he had buried so deeply? A flood of emotions swept over him. Grief, guilt, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite identify. He had always believed that his daughter's death was a chapter that had been closed, that it was an event he could never change. But now, in this small, fragile girl, he saw the remnants of the life he had lost. Was this fate? Or had he been blind to something all along? For the first time in years, Raphael felt the walls around his heart begin to crack, piece by piece. There was no going back now. The truth, whatever it was beginning to surface, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. But he knew one thing for certain. Isabel had come to him for a reason. And the path they were on, though uncertain and fraught with pain, was the only one he could take. As he sat beside her, watching her drift back into a light sleep, Raphael realized that this wasn't just about helping a child. This was about confronting everything he had tried to escape, his grief, his regrets, and the unresolved questions that had haunted him for 5 long years. And somehow, in this moment, he knew that facing those truths would be the only way to truly heal. The following days unfolded like a quiet storm, each moment heavier than the last as Raphael tried to make sense of everything that had begun to unravel. He had lived his life behind walls of his own making, protecting himself from the world, from people, from the pain that had been seared into his soul when he lost Emma. Yet now, with Isabel in his home, everything he had carefully built began to feel fragile, as though one wrong move would cause it all to crumble. He couldn't ignore the questions gnawing at him. Who was this child? How had she come to possess Emma's things? The bear, the jacket, the relics of his daughter's short life. Every time he looked at Isabel, he was reminded of his lost little girl, of the laughter, the promises, the dreams that had been stolen away far too soon. And yet there was something different about Isabel, something inexplicably connected to Emma in ways that seemed impossible. Raphael's interactions with Isabel remained strained. The girl didn't speak much. When she did, it was in short, soft words that barely reached him, as if she were holding her thoughts and emotions deep within her. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would hear her drawing in the corner of the living room, the sound of the pencil scratching against paper breaking the silence in the house. He was hesitant to ask her about it, unsure if he was ready to hear whatever story those pictures might tell. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Raphael found himself wandering the halls of his mansion, his thoughts restless. He had just finished reviewing the financial reports for Delion Technologies, but his mind was a million miles away, lost in the uncertainty of Isabel's presence in his life. He passed by the room where she was drawing, and for some reason, instead of continuing down the hall, he paused. There she was, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the sketchpad in front of her. The soft glow of a nearby lamp illuminated her delicate features, and Raphael couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of tenderness as he watched her. She was so small, so fragile, yet there was an undeniable strength in the way she held herself. Quiet, unyielding, despite the weight of the world that had clearly been placed upon her shoulders. He stepped into the room quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but Isabel looked up, as if sensing his presence. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw something there, something far beyond the pain and confusion he had seen before. There was a flicker of recognition, a knowing, as if she understood something that he did not. Raphael cleared his throat, unsure of how to begin. "What are you drawing, Isabel?" She hesitated for a long moment, her pencil hovering over the page, as though she were unsure whether she wanted to share it with him. Finally, she turned the sketchpad around, revealing her work. The image was simple, just a few lines, but it was unmistakably a picture of a little girl, drawn in careful strokes, with big, sad eyes. The girl was holding a teddy bear, the same one that had once belonged to Emma, and wearing a jacket with little embroidered butterflies. The drawing was so strikingly familiar that Raphael's breath caught in his throat. Is this you?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Isabel nodded silently, her eyes flickering to the bear that she still clutched tightly in her hands. "It's me and my mommy," she whispered. The words struck Raphael like a thunderclap. His heart hammered in his chest as the implications of what Isabel was saying began to settle in. "Your mommy," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Who is your mommy, Isabel?" The little girl's gaze dropped to the sketchpad again, her fingers tracing the edges of the drawing. "Mommy said you would know me," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Raphael froze. He could feel his blood run cold as the weight of her words sank in. Was this possible? Could this be true? Could Isabel's mother, this woman he had never met, this stranger, somehow be connected to him, to Emma? His mind raced, but no answers came. Only questions. So many questions that he didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to make sense of. Before he could speak again, Isabel stood up and moved towards him, her small hand reaching out to him with an almost desperate need. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. She pulled him by the hand into the hallway and toward the grand staircase. Raphael followed, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't process, couldn't control. At the top of the stairs, Isabel stopped in front of a door he hadn't noticed before. It was a door that led to the attic, a part of the house that had long been forgotten in the maze of corridors and rooms. Isabel turned to him, her face serious, her small hand gripping the door handle tightly. "Is this where?" Raphael began, but the question died in his throat. Isabel nodded, her eyes never leaving the door. "I think you'll understand if you look inside." With trembling hands, Raphael pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the otherwise silent house. As he stepped inside, he was hit by the smell of old wood and dust, the remnants of years untouched. The attic was cluttered with forgotten memories. Boxes piled high, old furniture covered with sheets, the ghosts of a life once lived. But there, in the corner of the room, was something that stopped Raphael in his tracks. It was a box, tucked away among the forgotten things. It was small, wooden, and old, but there was something about it that seemed to call to him. He moved toward it, his heart pounding in his chest, as if he were walking toward something he already knew, something he had buried deep within him, and had now returned to the surface. He opened the box slowly, his hands shaking, and inside he found a stack of photographs, letters, and a small tattered journal. The photographs were of a woman. Her face was blurry in most of them, but Raphael could tell that she had the same dark hair and eyes as Isabel. His breath caught as he flipped through the pages of the journal. The handwriting on the pages clear, though the ink had faded with time. One page caught his attention. It was dated 5 years ago, the year Emma had died. "To my dear Isabel," it began. "I know the world has been cruel to you. I know you've suffered more than any child should, but I promise you, you will be loved. You will be protected, just as I promised Emma all those years ago." Raphael's heart slammed into his chest, and his knees nearly gave way beneath him. He stood frozen in the attic, the world around him tilting, spinning out of control. The words were a thread, pulling him back to a past he hadn't known he still needed to confront. Emma had known Isabel's mother. Emma had known her in ways Raphael had never understood, had never been able to see. And now, in this moment, he realized that Isabel was not just a child in need of help. She was a piece of the puzzle he had been missing all these years, a link to the daughter he had lost, and the truth he had long buried. The room seemed to close in around him as everything he thought he knew about his life began to unravel. This wasn't just about helping a child. It was about unraveling the threads of his own history, facing the truth he had avoided for far too long. And no matter how difficult it was, Raphael knew that he couldn't turn away. Not now. As Isabel stood beside him, her small hand resting gently on his arm, Raphael felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. There was no going back. The truth had found him, and there was no escape from it. Raphael sat in the dimly lit attic, the weight of everything pressing down on him with an unbearable intensity. Isabel stood quietly beside him, her small form almost invisible against the towering stacks of old memories and forgotten relics. The journal in his hands felt heavier than it ever had, each word a shard of glass cutting through the numbness he had spent years building around his heart. He had thought he could escape the past, bury it deep enough that it would never reach him again. But now the past was staring him in the face, demanding to be acknowledged. He turned the page of the journal slowly, his eyes scanning the delicate script. each word a thread that pulled him deeper into a story he had never known. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, as if the writer had struggled to commit her thoughts to paper, torn between remembering and forgetting. He could feel his pulse quicken as he read on. "Raphael, I know you will never forgive me. I understand that. But I need you to know the truth about Isabel, about what happened that night. I never wanted you to find out like this, but fate has a way of unraveling the best laid plans." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Isabel's mother, this woman, this stranger he had never met, had been part of his life, part of Emma's life, in ways he couldn't possibly have understood. He read further, each sentence revealing more than he was ready to know. "Isabel is Emma's sister, Raphael. Your daughter had a half-sister, a sister she never knew, and I never wanted to tell you. But now, with Emma gone and Isabel at the door, I have no choice. Please don't blame her for my mistakes. I kept her away from you for so long, thinking it was the right thing to do. But I see now how wrong I was. She deserves to know you. She deserves a chance at the life I denied her." Raphael's breath caught in his throat. The room spun around him as his mind struggled to comprehend the enormity of what he was reading. Isabel was Emma's sister. His daughter had a sibling, someone he had never known about, someone whose existence had been hidden from him by a woman he hadn't known had been a part of his life at all. His thoughts swirled, too much to grasp at once. He looked over at Isabel, her small face illuminated by the soft glow of the attic light. She was staring at him, her wide eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Fear, hope, confusion. He could see now that there was a connection between them that went beyond the jacket, beyond the teddy bear. It was deeper, more intrinsic, as if their souls recognized something in each other that neither of them fully understood yet. Raphael's hand shook as he set the journal down, his mind reeling. He had spent years in the darkness, avoiding the painful memories of his daughter, keeping his emotions locked away, refusing to confront the grief that had consumed him. But now, everything was unraveling, and there was no denying the truth. Isabel, this little girl standing before him, was not just a child in need of help. She was family. She was his blood, and he had failed her just as much as he had failed Emma. The room felt too small, the walls closing in as Raphael tried to make sense of everything. How had he not known? How had he lived his life without knowing that Emma had a sister, that Isabel had existed? He couldn't fathom how something so important had been kept from him for so long. But now, in the silence of that attic, with only the distant sound of the wind outside and Isabel's steady breathing, Raphael realized that he couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the mistakes, the lost years. But he could do something now. He could choose to be the father that Isabel needed. He could choose to step into the role that had always been meant for him. With a deep breath, Raphael stood up, the weight of his decision settling heavily in his chest. He walked over to Isabel, his movements slow and deliberate. She didn't speak, didn't ask any questions, but there was a quiet understanding between them. He knelt down in front of her, meeting her eyes for the first time without the veil of his own pain clouding his vision. "I'm sorry," he said softly, the words tasting foreign in his mouth, but necessary. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through, for not knowing you sooner. But I'm here now. I'm not going to let you go through this alone." Isabel's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time since Raphael had met her, he saw her vulnerability, the raw emotion she had been holding back. She reached out, her small hands trembling as she placed them on his shoulders, and in that moment, Raphael knew that everything was changing. He wasn't just taking in a homeless child. He was embracing his daughter's sister, a child who had been abandoned in the same way his own daughter had been, left in the shadows of a world that had turned its back on them both. The journey ahead would not be easy. Raphael knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt, and the weight of the past would never fully disappear. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness that had consumed him for so long. He stood, lifting Isabel in his arms, her small body pressed against his chest. The attic was no longer just a room filled with forgotten memories. It was the beginning of something new. Raphael would not let Isabel face the world alone. He would be the father she deserved, and in doing so, he would heal the wounds that had been left by his daughter's death. As he carried Isabel down the stairs, he felt a sense of peace settling over him. It wasn't the peace of forgetting, of erasing the pain. It was the peace that comes from choosing to move forward, from embracing the difficult truths and the people who come into your life in unexpected ways. Isabel's presence in his home was no longer just a painful reminder of what he had lost. It was a symbol of everything he still had to gain. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Raphael was willing to face it. He didn't know what would come next, what challenges they would face together, but he was no longer afraid. He was no longer alone. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Isabel looked up at him, her voice a whisper. "Will you be my daddy?" The question, so simple yet so profound, cut through Raphael's heart like a blade. He stopped in his tracks, staring down at the little girl in his arms. She had asked for something he had been too afraid to offer for years. His love, his protection, his acceptance. With a lump in his throat, Raphael nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Isabel. I'll be your daddy."